People haven't been here long, maybe only 15 to 16,000 years since spread out of Africa. And in fact, one of the odd things is we probably spent 7,000 years people in Beringia before there was a corridor coming down in Western United States, or boats could travel along the Pacific Sea and disperse along the coast and then overland. So people have only been here. It's highly debated, but we look at some of the oldest dates. One of the oldest one is actually down in South America, 15,000 years. So people fled out of Beringia, and who were these people? They were hunter-gatherers in small tribes and extended families. And they stayed that way for an enormous length of time, almost 10 or 12, 13,000 years. So when we think about what was sacred to these people, what was sacred to them, probably their tools. These are amazing Clovis points, and they needed it. This is one of the routes we think people came into North America. And when they came around 13,000 years ago, they met these amazing mammals, the megafauna, elephants, and bison, and horses, sloths, camels. The horse, of course, would disappear until the Spanish brought it back. So we have very little idea what these people were like, just some of their stone tools. And one of the interesting questions of all these magnificent megafauna mammals, they went extinct around 8,000 years ago. Did people cause this? We're not sure. Only the sort of quotidian common animals survived. Now, we talked about this, and then there's a handout. We're going to look at the Mississippian, which is really a very recent phenomenon. And then one of the puzzling things, the Mississippian was a culture that took over half of North America, or at least the United States, and was extensive and very ritualistic, although we're not quite sure what they worshiped. And then they disappeared very, very quickly. So before that, of course, I can't get this to change. I just mentioned this site in Montana. It's one of the oldest sites in North America. It's 12,000 years, and it's an infant buried. But it isn't just the fact that it was buried, which of course presumes the people's understanding of an afterlife. It was surrounded by over 100 intricately done stone tools, bone tools, and much ochre. And it suggests that this child was very special, not just to the parents, but perhaps to the tribe. And interestingly, it was reburied after some contests between lawyers and so on. So even 13,000 years ago, these people were burying and honoring their infants in some way, and honoring their adults with ochre coatings and so on. We also have to remember that what we think about Native Americans is different than the reality, in the sense that if you see a map where tribes are, that isn't where they developed. Beginning in the 1830 with the Relocation Act, we already had laws moving Indians around, especially in Midwest and Eastern United States. They were forced to migrate to places they weren't familiar with. So Native Americans may live today in places that they were not used to. their sacred sites were left behind. They had to modify or adapt to new places. So even tribes you may not know about, Lene, Lenape, you probably know about the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee, but Ho-Chunk people from Wisconsin were moved all the way to Nebraska just to make way. I like this because it shows how quickly, starting from 1776, how quickly Native Americans disappeared, and also how they were forced into small reservations in the Western US. So what was lost? Languages, sacred sites, sacred traditions. So I'm going to talk mostly about this period, the Mississippian cultures, which goes back about 1,200 years, and then a little bit about the modern. And when we look up here, this little green section, going back about 10,000 years, not 15,000 years in the United States, but 10,000 years, this is one of the most important times. These are petroglyphs, and they're pretty remarkable because they're very incised, they're very deep, and they're very, very old. We think these may be the oldest in North America, going back about 14,000 years ago. And they happen to be around the old Lake Pyramid. There still is a Lake Pyramid, but this was the Pleistocene lake near Lake Tahoe. And because the lake rose and fell, these things got coated. And so we know when the lake rose and covered some of this. Imagine people here living around this giant lake about 13,000 years ago. Another sad fact to consider, probably 90% of all the indigenous people between the 1500s and the 1600s died, not necessarily because of bloodshed, but because of diseases that were brought in. 90%. So it's amazing that people managed to keep their traditions and their beliefs alive, not to mention their languages. There's a lot of claimants. I'll mention this one. In New Hampshire. This is supposed to be America's Stonehenge, but it looks too neat. It looks like a big workplace. And even though you can visit it and see all sorts of things, oops. For instance, it will tell you that you're here, but it'll also tell you, oh, this place was set up according to the sun. Well, no, it's not. And any place you can do this with, you can show where your North Star is through the middle of your house and so on. All of this is very suspicious. It looks historic, but nonetheless, people promote it. They love to call this the sacrificial altar, but when you look at it and you see it drains, there must have been a lot of blood. No, this was probably a fruit press or a lye leaching apparatus, historical. And then people like to point out, look at this, hieroglyphs. No, that's just something people made up. It doesn't even look runic. And these sorts of ideas are still perpetuated. There's a historic channel on the television that talks about these things as if they were experts, but anyway, it's mostly hokum. Come on. Okay. Why?
Roger?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
If you just back up one to the slide you're on.
Yeah, I'm trying to. For some reason.
The letters on that stone,
Yeah.
yes, on the lower right.
Oh, they look like Hebrew, I know.
Yeah. Yeah. There
Is
may
that
be
what
some that are a little off, but fundamentally they are Hebrew letters.
Okay.
Which is, I don't know how they get to be here.
Uh, I'll show you another rock, which is rather interesting.
Okay.
Oops. Any of you who are from the East, or you've traveled up in the Sierra Nevada, these are mysterious rocks until you understand glaciology. They're called the mysterious megaliths, but they're literally plucked up 10,000 years ago in glaciers, moved across states, and then when the glaciers melted, they just dropped them and they came to rest. Sometimes they came to rest on other rocks. But these are called glacial erratics. Any of you have been elsewhere, uh, Ireland, Scotland, this is a famous one that's pictured all over in Yosemite. But they claim that there's dolmens, that there's mounds, that there's Norse artifacts, and you have to be very leery of these things. Likewise, glaciers can produce these amazing mounds, sometimes very streamlined. You can see the glacier moved over it this way. These are called drumlins. If you dig into them, they're just gravel. There's nothing significant about them other than that this was a glacial landscape. When glaciers melt in place, the lake or the rivers will drain the lakes and you will get gravel filling up the riverbed that's running under the ice. And these may snake all across the countryside, and these are called eskers. And people sometimes mistake them for earthen structures. This is a dubious Dighton rock in Massachusetts. These are not typical petroglyphs, but this is supposed to be, some people claim that there's Phoenician letters in here, Portuguese letters in here, all sorts of things. It's, again, very dubious. It's now a state park. This rock in Rhode Island has a curious history. It was claimed to be written upon with runic letters by Leif Erikson. Someone got tired of it, picked it up and dropped it into the bay. Later it was resurfaced. It's now a state park, but there's a lot of very dubious things, especially Leif Erikson's runic writing. Other things that are claimed to be petroglyphs, there's almost no petroglyphs like this anywhere in North America. They're too comical, they're too immature or childish, but nonetheless, people claim them. There's one very interesting place in Western Massachusetts. It's puzzling because it's on the top of a small mountain that's actually a blueberry farm. And it's got a granite that it's exposed. And there are some menhirs, but who knows who put them up. And later, people began to build the circle. By the 1700s, people knew about Stonehenge, so they maybe wanted to create something here. A lot of people think this is a boundary marker. There are genuine earth forms. This is one in Ontario. It's partially a serpent-like, and it's aligned. And remember this one's aligned with the solstice sun, which is very, very interesting because we'll see another serpentine mound not too far away. Some people call these adjacent mounds eggs, but no one's quite sure what this is. But it did look like it was used for a solar observatory. Sacred spots may be closer than you think. This is on the west side of, along the Hudson River in New York City. It's a well-known cave in Inwood Park, and it has lots of artifacts, even some petroglyphs on it. And most people don't even know it's there. Mountains, of course, in the East have always been sacred. Some of them are vandalized or were turned into quarries, like Mount Waldo in Maine. but many others were very sacred in terms of origin myths and others. Overlook Mountain, which is has an overseer in terms of native populations, but they also come up with some rather strange things. This just looks like a wall, but they have painted it to show that it must have been a serpent at one time, and not just a serpent, but a horned serpent. So some things may be real and other things may be made up to emphasize the sacred nature. It doesn't do any good to invent things, however. Mount Cadillac, which is the first place the sun falls on in North America, is an amazing spot. Uh, there's evidence of probably Vision Quest structures built on top of it, and it looks over Bar Harbor and the fog and whatnot, make it a very mysterious, mystical place. Mount Katahdin, which, by the way, scared the pie out of Henry David Thoreau when he went there. And for good reason. It does make its own weather and often gets amazing clouds. And tremendous thunderstorms often start from here. And this was the Iroquois legend of the birth of the Thunderbird was born on Mount Katahdin, and it rescued people. It flew down, and the Thunderbird is one of the most universal symbols across North America. Uh, Even in the West, where thunder and lightning are pretty rare, sometimes it's understandable that these may be vultures or they may be condors, or it's just the Thunderbird. And Thunderbird came down and fought the great horned serpent, Wawondi Nawag, the horned serpent, which is kind of a meme. Uh, this is a very interesting petroglyph, but there are drawings, and these drawings from all over the US show the horned serpent and the great fight with the Thunderbird and the horned serpent. And it was defeated by the Thunderbird, and people were able to live in peace. Most serpents in the United States do not have horns. This is an asp, which is horned, but almost all the reptiles in the United States, with the exception of the sidewinder. And how the sidewinder got from here to New York, no one really knows, and it's not likely unless someone actually did trade it. So the horned serpent is a bit of a mystery. A little bit easier to understand, Mishpashua is a strange creature that in the central part of the US, in the Lake District, Algonquin belief is that the Thunderbird came down and wrestled Mishpashua and defeated him. And it's supposedly a swimming cat, perhaps a panther, or more likely, when you look at some of the petroglyphs, it's more likely a lynx that somehow swims. In other southern parts of the US, it's considered a swimming panther. And then to add elements to it, it becomes horned, like the horned serpent. And this is not uncommon in mythological creations, putting a horn on something like even the devil, which has horns. And if you take this one step further, every state has some mythical creature they have created. Perhaps maybe the Chamber of Commerce helped create it, but Loch Ness type of monsters are found all over the East Coast. There's even an octopus, giant turtles, and swamp creatures down there. So every state seems to have one. Lake monsters, even one in Canada. What's the name? Ogopogo. Lake Aconcagua. Native people looked at the earth as the spirit dwellings, and any spirit was born in the earth, and features in the earth show birthplaces, fights, struggles, and so some places become very important because they indicate where spirits were born or struggled or fought other evil spirits, like Franconia. And Franconia also has some beautiful waterfalls, and waterfalls produce a lot of negative ions, but people love them, and they also are revered in almost every native tradition. They don't have to be big. In fact, in many cases, some of the smaller ones are just as important for meditation sites, offering to spirits, and also vision quest. And we've always looked at springs as very crucial. In the old world, they were honored and still are honored as shrines. And most of our springs have been developed or turned into bottled water, but springs are always a source of spirit and energy in terms of what the spirits can bring. Anything unusual in the Earth's surface may be construed as a place of emergence, a fight, or a message. And this is a actually big fossiliferous area of limestone that actually, these are stromatolites. These are old mounds of algae, and they've been weathered. And so it looks like a petrified sea garden. And people used to come here and also collect parts of these fossils and put them in their medicine bundles because they knew this was special. It had power just beyond understanding. So this was a very powerful site. Bits of meteors have long been very, very important because they are things from the celestial kingdom. This one is known as Manitou's stone. There's been a lot of fighting over it. It's in Canada, and Manitou, is, you may remember, is one of the great mysterious spirits. I might mention today that these things are still among the most expensive things to buy. Bill Gates is one of the world's largest collectors of meteorites. In some places, like province of Manitoba, which is named after Manitou and thought to be one of his strongholds, people would honor the spirit by making altars, places for prayers, by outlining the spirit on with rocks. These are called petroforms. They're a little different than pecking on the rock or drawing on the rock. So many petroforms, turtle earth, if you remember that story with the sky woman. This is in West Whiteshell Provincial Park in Manitoba. Lake Superior, wonderful lakes and outcrops. This is actually a provincial park on the Ontario side. And here is the underwater panther. And here's also the serpent, perhaps not horned, but nonetheless, these were the two evil creatures that lived under the ocean or under the lakes. And this was probably Thunderbird coming down. The same thing in Bon Echo. This is Nanabush, who's actually a trickster bunny. You may have heard of the trickster of coyote or raven, but in Algonquin tradition, it's a bunny. All along the Great Lakes region and up into the lakes of lower Canada, there are petroglyphs and sacred spots, and many of these are protected with provincial parks, as you can see. Here's the Petroglyph Provincial Park in Ontario, very well protected with a building enclosing it. This is often said to be Manitou himself, often reproduced in books as a definite sign that aliens have visited us in the past, but it may represent a vision that someone had on a vision quest of what Manitou would be like. Again, geographic features, geologic features like the Chimney Bluffs along Lake Ontario would be places that spirits would be very strong and people would come for vision quests. Places that seem very bucolic, like the Susquehanna River, are actually riddled all up and down its course with petroglyphs. And some of these petroglyphs are somewhat debatable. Obviously, fish. This wasn't an early sign for Christianity, but these particular forms are thought to be fertility symbols, being uvula or other things related to that. Here is another part of the Susquehanna near Safe Harbor. These are chalked in so you can see them. Many body figures. Actually, this figure is a swift or a falcon. There's another fish. One way you can bring these to light is just by wetting them a little bit. And then we come to Judicula Rock down in North Carolina. It almost looks too fantastic to be real, but it is partly because the depth of the incision and the fact the uniformity, and what it means is another question. It's still exposed, by the way, in Coolawee Creek. It's thought to be a map of the region with various rivers, the Tuskegee River, the Little Tennessee, and so on. But I love these, obviously a spaceship or a flying octopus, but these could be psychedelic, although there were only mushrooms that could be taken, but this is still a mysterious thing and very intriguing. Caves, which we've long marveled at and long been used as sacred sites and initiation sites, especially for children, and also shaman sites for contacting the spirits. This is the Manitou Cave in Alabama. Again, Manitou was one of the great creative spirits. There are petroglyphs here. They're pretty well worn, and they're all modern ones. But this is one of the most intriguing aspects. This is actually Cherokee, and this dates from the very early 1800s, and some of it is written backwards on the wall. And the theory is that the spirits who live inside the wall could read it then, and it narrates their lamenting that they're going to be forced to move. It also starts out how faithful they were because they played 4 days of lacrosse before they came down. Lacrosse and other sports are sacred in the sense that they were rituals and they were purification, and they were very, very heartily undertaken as these purification rituals and would be played for days on end. We don't have that kind of sport anymore. Here's Manitou Cave, one of the interests. There are petroglyphs. This looks like a mountain lion and who knows, maybe wildcats, but there are also these things that were made with mud, and they eventually will harden and looks like an owl. Here's another one, mud glyphs, and here's another one. This is found in Dunbar Cave in Tennessee. If you know anything about Tennessee, it has lots and lots of caves, lots of waterfalls. Many of them had sacred uses. This is Russell Cave National Monument in Alabama. The petroglyphs are somewhat lost because it's been used repeatedly, and campfires and so on have marred much of it, but it is a national monument. And one of my favorites is I spent quite a bit of time here as a kid. It's up in the Poconos in Bucks County, not too far from the Susquehanna. But this is an avalanche field and beautiful granite. And if you tap the rock, and you can see how much it's been tapped, it rings, and each rock has a different resonance and different tone. And if you get a bunch of crazy kids with hammers, it is quite a fascinating place, and it does become spiritual in a way with the resonance. You can feel it through your body and through your head. Evidence that these have been beaten on for a long time, so that the Lenape who lived around here probably used it as a sacred site, perhaps dances and chants and music. One kind of iconic mountain that is unfortunately been bastardized with sculpture and other things and amusement parks and so on. Stone Mountain originally had a number of vision huts on the top, and it is still noted that there are carvings and other things on the top, and it was undoubtedly a very important place for people to use for vision quest and dancing and other kinds of ceremonies. It still is a major powwow area, and people come at the base of it mostly in the spring for spring powwows. Nearby at Chatsworth, Fort Mountain is similar in that it may have had a village, but there are many defensive walls and also sort of smaller seclusional places made out of rock walls. And of course, lots and lots of waterfalls, which would be an ideal place for vision quests. One of the treatments was to actually sit under the waterfalls to test your tolerance, and it was part of the ritual of fasting and sleep deprivation, and also testing your thermal abilities. There are petroglyphs. Many of them have been desecrated in some respects, but this is near in the Chattahoochee National Forest. Again, these are often interpreted as fertility symbols, although these are a little bit floral in their arrangement, but repeated quite often on the rock. But that can be interpreted as fertility with flowers. It does look a lot like sunflowers, and sunflowers were actually domesticated very, very early on in the United States. That's one of the first native domesticates in North America. This is a remarkable place also in Georgia, and it is an effigy, a stone effigy, and it has this path leading up to it. It's very impressive, but made out of stones rather than mounded over with dirt. There was a burial and also a couple of knives found in it, or spear points found in it. Other places, just because of the mountain, the nature of the mountain and the waterfalls and the ruggedness, Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in particular is noted by many Native Americans as a place that should be designated as a sacred area. And then we're going to go to the Midwest, and This may not seem like an important spot. It's geologically very interesting because it has a very unusual stone. And this was a sort of neutral area because every native person and every tradesperson, that is, there were a subgroup of people who actually traveled across the North America trading objects. And this pipestone national monument is one of the materials that these people came for. It's an unusual catlinite clay that hardens. It's relatively soft at first. You can see there's a monument, a native monument with bison skulls and so on. And it was easy to work with, especially when it was soft. It's very similar to argillite, argillite from Queen Charlotte, although argillite is black. This is red, clay-like, soft, easily carved, and then made into pipe stems or pipe stones. And these were valuable and heavily traded. You could also make beads, and then here's the pipe stone itself with a long stem. And smoking was ritual, and tobacco was sacred, and smoke is sacred. The first puff you never took yourself, you gave it to Manitou or Wakantaka or whoever your guardian spirit was. You extended your pipe to the spirit and they took the first puff. Today, you can still find artifacts or fetishes and so on, but these are very valued things. Unfortunately, mostly turned into kind of kitschy stuff. Here's an unusual, sad story right outside of St. Paul. It's a cave that a little spring came out of and was covered with petroglyphs. And then the railroad bought it and damaged a lot of the rock to build the railroad bed. And eventually, because so many people would come down, they covered it over. But some people drew what the petroglyphs were like initially. So many of these things have been lost from damage, from desecration and other things. Again, in Minnesota, there is an outcropping of very hard reddish rock, and this is covered with very large petroglyphs, some of them which signify stellar features, and it's a real black sky area even today. Many of these are interpreted as what they would see in Perseus and so on. And then, of course, probably hunt symbols, magic hunting, and then shamanistic kind of figures. It's in southern Minnesota and quite expansive. Of course, burials are very important and were always considered sacred. This is a reconstruction of an above ground burial in Virginia, and many other grave sites are not known, but when they are known, people are very interested in how they were managed in terms of ritual. This is Temukia. These are northern Florida, and this is a mound, and you notice a kind of conch there, and the sorrow as this person is buried, and the wailing and so on. Initially, graves were mounded, so there could be only one person in here. You see the grave. And then mounds were often put outside the villages, not unlike the same thing that happened in England and in Europe. Sometimes there were not abattoirs, but carnal houses. This is a place to visit, Fort Walton Beach, where there's several temple mounds. And often there would be these beautiful shell adornments that were buried with people. Sometimes the whole shell would be carved, sometimes pieces of the shell. And this is a very common form that we see throughout the mound tradition in central United States. As the mound tradition caught on, more and more mounds were built, bigger mounds. This is the Fountain of Youth burial. Over 100 Timucuan burials. They have since been reburied, but this was an excavation of one of the big mounds and in St. Augustine, and it has since been reburied. These Timucuans were also sun worshippers and often made sacrifices to the sun, danced, chanted, smoked, prayed. They also showed the beginning of a priesthood, and this is obvious because of the adornments and also the status that they achieved. And this is part and parcel of the development of the mound culture. Villages then around 900 AD began to build mounds, maybe one or two mounds, and the priest would live on top of the mounds. And these were not burial mounds. The burial mounds would be off in the distance somewhere. They often would palisade this to protect the village, and then the fields were around the outside. Now, around 1000 AD, Tessanate began to, and corn began to come up from Middle America. And again, how this was traded is somewhat a mystery, but it was adapted and modified in the central part of the United States around the 900, and corn became a very crucial product. Mounds became bigger, the villages became bigger, the mounds became complicated in terms of their burial. There was more food to feed people. Corn became a staple, became one of the great three sisters. In Florida, many of these villages were along springs, and these springs became quite sacred. And if you've been traveling at all in Florida, you can visit some of these like Ginny Springs, Crystal River, and so on. These are actually upwelling from underwater or underground cave systems, and it is very pure, beautiful water. So these were considered sacred. Also surrounding them were these beautiful bald cypress swamps. This is one of my favorite places to kayak. And the mound culture began to take off, especially in Florida, where they used shells rather than mud. They didn't have much mud. As you know, Florida is quite flat. So they used clam shells and so on, and they built the mounds, and they built houses on top, which would help during hurricanes and so on. And you can see these shell mounds. There are sacred trees in the East, even though there's a lot of forest. The red cedar, which is hard to find really big mature ones these days, is a sacred tree. It was ideal for flutes, very light, melodious, and scented. The flat sprays were very important in terms of smudging and also in ceremonies. And it is said that the thunderbird never hit the red cedar with its lightning. And the wood, if you carve it, of course, is this beautiful bright red wood. And if you had a grandmother, she might have had a red cedar chest, which is absolutely fragrant and prevents moths and other insects from eating your wool sweaters. This was used quite extensively in building, but also in ceremonial smoke. Eventually, people used red cedar trees as axis mundis, that is, even in the center of these massive compounds. And this looks like Central America, but this is Illinois. And this is a replica or a recreation of Cahokia. And this is the ball field, if you will. And in the middle is a giant red cedar. And elsewhere, there is basically a wood henge built out of red cedar. And in the middle of that was red cedar. And each priestly mound was marked with a red cedar. So the cities start out relatively small. Most of them are palisaded or use nearby water to help protect them. It meant that not everything was hunky-dory. It meant that there was conflicts, and the priest or the leader, the chief here, had to negotiate with neighboring groups and also with the farmers and the neighboring fields. You notice there's a walkway, in essence, a main street that comes in, and there may be different priests in different areas or different chiefs. So they started small. Again, here's Palisade with a local river. They got bigger. They would become trade markets and also food markets, and then huge ball fields for what was called stickball, which eventually turned into lacrosse. Stickball is still played, and also another game I'll tell you about in a minute. So the early mountain cultures also began their own form of plant domestication, and they used local grasses, and they used sunflowers, and they used local cucurbits, that is gourds and squash and pumpkins. And these are areas where all of these native plants show up as pollen or seeds. So before the corn came in, there was already plant domestication, goosefoot, yellow squash, and so on. These were native North American things. Corn came in around 900 and it was added. And then beans came in and were added from Central America. And so the first corn was this teosante, and then it was cultivated, hybridized, and then exported actually with the Columbian exchange. But it quickly became part of the Three Sisters. So you had corn, beans that would climb up, and then squash that would protect against birds and so on, and the beans would fertilize. So the Three Sisters was a very important thing that allowed the population to grow and allowed the ceremonies to get more elaborate, the chiefdoms to become more organized. Here is a city, a mound culture, very large one with a kind of central platform or plaza mound, and another mound, which was the subsequent ball field in Georgia. These are all reconstructions. And history tells us that when individual populations get above 2,000, you sort of need a leader, and a leader naturally is developed, and it becomes sort of a chiefdom, but it also gets more extensive than that, because the chief may be the political person, but there's also a priest who takes care of the ritual thing. So this developed for a brief time in the United States. And with this, craftspeople and extensive trade networks. Some of these cities grew to be over 10,000 people. And this is the social status with a great sun god, priest, and then the workers below it. Interestingly, recently an analysis was done looking at the status inherent in these shell medallions, and they matched it to organization and social structure, so that in the north around Cahokia and Etowah, it was really well organized. So, but in the South, it was a little less organized. So with this extra food and with the mounds, there came complex ceremonies. It was said that there was a perpetual fire, that even the priest had one up on their mound. There were numerous sweat lodges still, and whenever burials occurred, there would be human sacrifice. It sounds very, very much like Mayan, and some people think still that there is a connection. But the bulk were commoners, laborers in the farm, mostly extended families who did the farming, and also craftspeople, because this became a very important commercial center using copper. These are earlobe buttons. These are buttons too for the earlobe, ritualistic daggers, and so on. Pearls, the Mississippi and all of those, Ohio, all of those rivers had tremendous quantities of freshwater mussel. And mussels are not only tasty, they are capable of producing pearls. So pearls were produced and traded. They're not often found because it was a rare commodity. However, the shell of that freshwater mussel is still harvested and carved into seeds for almost the entire world pearl industry. So inside your pearl, okia, or Japanese pearl or Chinese pearl, more likely, there is a seed from the Mississippi mussel. Clay, obsidian, hard stone. These again are the discs, and this is one of the most unusual material. This is mica, which you may know from the inside of toasters. It's a very delicate mineral. It will peel off, but they carved it into all sorts of things. They did acquire gold from northern states. They were excellent potters, and often with showing us what the faces look like, often tattooed heavily, and river creatures that were very important. So the trade network from Cahokia went up these rivers, the Ohio River, Illinois, Missouri, and the traders would come back with obsidian, copper from the lakes, grizzly bear teeth, lead, quartz, shells. One of the things that came over was wampum, and so on. So very huge trade networks, sometimes extending all the way out to this California, because this trade network to here in Chaco Canyon would bring abalone, and the trade network from there would take turquoise, and sometimes turquoise this way. So it was possible for traders to actually move this distance and bring different items, and then this distance to Cahokia. Cahokia, by the 1050 or 100, 1100 AD, probably had a bigger population than London at the same time. Equal sized pyramids, lesser ones, perhaps the chief, priest, and then the big ball field. Big, huge plaza. Recently, LIDAR has found a main road going quite a ways south out of this, and a wood henge that was built out of red cedar trees and could be used to cite the solstices and the equinoxes. It wasn't that crucial, perhaps, except for ceremonies. The farmers knew when to plant, when to harvest, but the ceremonies had to fall on a particular date, and calendars traditionally have been developed for religious and ceremonial reasons. So wood henge, probably in several other places as well, but this is one that is definitely known. And you can see this big, huge ball field, stick ball, but also another game called chunky. And chunky is hard to understand. It's played with a clay discoid, sometimes actually hand ground down, and they bowl it, and then they throw uh, their spears at it. Sometimes they try to get the spear through the middle. It's not really known how it was played. It's a little bit like the Mayan ball games, but you can see people here bowling with it and then chasing it. These discoids were very common in burials, and these games would last for days and be very crucial in terms of purifying and getting ready for some ceremony as well. Also, there was a very important black drink made out of what is called yampum, and it's actually a holly, an ilex, and you didn't use berries. The berries were too toxic, but the leaves could be brewed into a very potent caffeine, theobromine rich drink. It often would be too toxic and people would drink it and then vomit. So, but the caffeine was substantial and people would be altered by drinking it. It's one of the human universals. We love to get altered in one way or another, playing the game, dancing, drinking. In this case, they were kind of at a wit's end, but they did manage to bring ilex into it. This is ilex in flower in the berry. Again, you don't use the berry, but and ilex, by the way, is related to mate. It's in the same family, mate being the South American equivalent, but very high in theobromine and theophylline, as well as caffeine. Here is a very interesting drawing showing a shaman throwing up, emesis, having drunk it. And it was probably used in shamanistic rituals. Bear seemed to be a very important shamanistic animal. This is from Spiro Mound. A puzzle, there are many puzzles here, but one of the puzzles are these long-nosed god maskettes. They were actually probably ear ornaments, and they were separable. That is, you could have the nose actually slide in here, and it looked like you would stab somebody with it, but these were probably inserted into an earlobe, this whole piece here, and worn. We don't know what they represented. Could be a certain god, but they show up all along here. If a priest or a chief died, then it may have been the honor of young virgins and young men to actually be executed. This is it looks like a knife, but it is probably thought to be a bludgeon. Women would be sacrificed, laid, and then a mound put over the top of it as a burial mound. Again, there might be another sacrifice on top of that mound, and then on top of the mound again. Very reminiscent of Mayan traditions. Recent bone analysis shows that many of the people in here were quote unquote migrants, and they use that word carefully because they didn't look like slaves. They didn't have the same kind of bone wear that slaves would have. These were probably volunteers, and they were probably immigrants who wanted to come to these big city complexes where everything was happening and so much was available. But these young people would celebrate the ability to be sacrificed. They would follow in the case of the priest. And here is a picture of a priest, very ornamental. This is actually a copper piece up here and so on. And one of the mounds at Cahokia, over 1,000 people buried in the mound. Well, the mound was built up over years. In some cases, the genders were separated, and in some cases, the heads were cut off, and in some cases, the heads and the hands were cut off of these sacrificial people, but no one really knows the meaning of those. Here is a priest with a ritual axe and a head, the same in a diskette. Now, from the mounds, we turn to some very puzzling mounds that probably show how rich and diverse their spiritual life was. Mounds could be important to designate the status of the priest or the chief. They could be a burial. In some cases, they could be honoring a particular spirit or god or guardian spirit. This is one of the few human ones. Unfortunately, it's bisected by a road. It's in Wisconsin, which a lot of these are found. Here are falcons, and here is the marching bear group with also another goose or falcon in it. And there is a wonderful visitor center built around this, the Effigy Mound National Monument in Marquette, Iowa. And there's even perhaps a lizard, or more likely that underwater panther. There's the marching bear mound. Here's showing where it is along the Mississippi River. There's another cluster of these along the Wisconsin River. And interestingly, these are built up above rivers. And so why? Perhaps it was easier to get the mud, or it was a place that these could be seen. Some of these look like foxes, thought to be lizards, and so on. LIDAR has been used a lot to show that there are many of these that are still hidden. If you're on the ground, they often look like this. This is the marching bear. This is along a series of lakes in, I think this is this is Iowa. And you can see all the different forms. Some of these are called lizards, some may be dogs. No one really knows what all of these are. They may be minks or panthers, but you can see the extent of these. And these are probably honoring individual spirit guides, or a totem for a family, or a totem for the tribe. Many of these things are gone, sadly. This is a map of where effigy mounds have been found. Most of them have been plowed under, so it was as important as the mounds themselves. And people had to make time to lug the mud up from the river in baskets and so on. So this is puzzling, because these may be burial mounds, and then birds which would take their spirits. It's hard to understand what is in fact going on in many of these. Again, part of the effigy mound complex with a bird and a bear. This is a rabbit, maybe nunbush. There was the trickster rabbit. And again, this is mostly along the Wisconsin River basin. LIDAR is used to see how extensive these were. LIDAR is a basically penetrating, vegetation penetrating radar that's actually mostly flown by drones. And so this shows how extensive these were, with swans or other sorts of things along the Mississippi River. Here again, this is along the Wisconsin River. And then some of these are reminiscent of the wood hedge in Cahokia. These are very elaborate circles and pathways that, when people figured it out, it turned out to be a solar observatory. This is in Heath, Ohio. Most of this is still wooded, so they're undergoing the process of removing the wood so you can see this. It's also near one of the famous lizard or alligator mound. And so this will align up with summer solstice. So this is sometimes called the Newark, named after the spot where it occurs, Newark. And so you also have a moon set that you can follow, and a sunrise. So it's a little complicated. And then, of course, the great Serpent Mound in Ohio. It is not sure if it is really a serpent, but it is certainly serpentine. And the puzzle in part has to do with its head. Some people have called it actually a giant spermatozoan. There have been excavations, and at various places, it was obviously built over time, often as individual burials, and then another burial, and then another burial on top of that, another burial on top of that, and another burial. And sometimes people just stuck in at the top. It's not completely a burial, but many, many burials occur in it. So both an effigy to the horned monster or an effigy to the afterlife. During the winter, it has lanterns around the edge of it. And it too lines up with the sun. Here's the sunrise and the equinox, here's the sunset. The head actually seems to have maybe little fins or something. They don't often show it, but there's evidence that there might have been fins. And this, to me, there is a salamander that lives in the Mississippi and all along the eastern seaboard that actually has just two fins. And it may just be a salamander rather than a snake, or it may be a giant sperm. No one really knows, but it is one of the most remarkable features in the mound culture, both as a burial and also as an effigy. And it might be pointing the way for the souls. Many people in the native tradition felt that they had 4 different souls, one of which who would stay around the grave, one of which who would come back to be reborn, one of which who would go to a kind of afterlife, and one of which would go to a spiritual existence. Very complicated, but this may point the way to the afterlife. The Serpent Mound is also unique because very adjacent to it is a 300-million-year-old asteroid impact crater. Now, nobody was around when that thing hit, but it does produce a geomagnetic anomaly, and people may be sensitive and pick this up. And there may have been ejecta, or what are called tektites, that were found there that made this a special place to begin with. Meteor craters around the world are used as spiritual places. So a whirlwind tour of one of the most interesting cultures in North American history that was a very focused spiritual center, and then disappeared around 1600, right about the time that the Spanish arrived. In fact, De Soto visited several of these places and then later brought some artists. So there was white contact. We don't know if diseases were manifest at that time, but then things sort of backslid and became atavistic, and the traditional people basically were put under threat by the new immigrants.